You've been dreaming about writing that novel for 3 years now. You bought the perfect notebook, downloaded Scrivener, even told your friends about it at that dinner party. You wrote for 2 weeks straight, felt amazing, and then nothing. It's been 4 months and you haven't opened the document. Or maybe it's the business idea, the YouTube channel, learning Spanish, getting in shape. The things you actually care about, the things that light you up when you think about them, those are the exact things gathering dust in your mental graveyard. And here's what makes it worse. You don't quit the stuff you don't care about. You show up to your boring job every single day. You respond to emails from people you barely know. You scroll through social media for hours. But that one thing, that thing that actually matters to you, that could actually change your life, you can't seem to stick with it for more than a few weeks. My name is Dave, and I spend way too much time thinking about self-sabotage and why we destroy the things we claim to want most. If you're someone who has a graveyard of abandoned projects that you swear you were passionate about, make sure to hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. Look, here's the thing most people don't understand about quitting. We've been taught this completely backward story about discipline and motivation and willpower. The conventional wisdom says you quit because you don't want it badly enough, because you're lazy, because you lack discipline. And that story is not just wrong, it's dangerously wrong. Because when you believe that story, you start to think there's something fundamentally broken about you. You start to identify as someone who can't finish things. And that identity becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. I want you to understand something that might sound completely counterintuitive. You don't quit the things you care about because you don't care enough. You quit them precisely because you care too much. A study published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology in 2019 found that people are significantly more likely to abandon goals they rated as highly important to their self-concept than goals they rated as moderately important. The researchers followed over 800 people for 6 months and found that the dropout rate for goals people described as crucial to their identity was 63% compared to 41% for goals they just thought would be nice to achieve. Think about that for a second. The more something matters to you, the more likely you are to quit it. Now, you might be thinking, Dave, that makes absolutely no sense. Why would caring more make you quit more? And this is where it gets really interesting, because the answer reveals something fundamental about how your brain protects you from psychological threats. Here's what's actually happening. When something matters deeply to you, when it's tied to your identity and your sense of who you want to become, every single action you take toward that goal becomes a test. Every time you sit down to write, you're not just writing, you're testing whether you're actually a writer. Every time you work on your business, you're not just working, you're testing whether you're actually an entrepreneur. And here's the brutal part. Your brain knows that the more you engage with something, the more data you're going to collect about your performance. And what if that data is bad? What if you write and it's terrible? What if you launch your business and it fails? A researcher named Jennifer Crocker at Ohio State University spent over a decade studying what she calls contingent self-worth, and her findings are absolutely fascinating. She found that when our self-esteem is contingent on success in a domain we care about, we develop what she calls a validation-seeking mindset. We're not actually focused on learning or growing or getting better. We're focused on proving we're already good enough. And when you're in that mindset, every piece of negative feedback, every setback, every day you don't perform perfectly becomes evidence that maybe you're not who you thought you were. So your brain does something incredibly clever. It gets you to quit before you have enough data to disprove your ideal self-image. Think about it. If you quit after 2 weeks, you can tell yourself, I didn't really give it a fair shot. I was too busy. I'll do it right next time. Your dream of being a novelist stays intact. You're not someone who tried to write a novel and failed. You're someone who's going to write a novel, you just haven't done it yet. That distinction is psychologically massive. This is what psychologists call self-handicapping, and it's one of the most misunderstood protective mechanisms your brain has. A meta-analysis published in Psychological Bulletin analyzed over 120 studies on self-handicapping and found that people who score high on measures of contingent self-worth are up to 4 times more likely to create obstacles to their own success. They procrastinate. They don't prepare adequately. They create chaos in their lives right before important deadlines. And they don't do this because they're lazy or stupid. They do it because having an excuse for failure is psychologically less threatening than finding out you gave it everything and still weren't good enough. Now, let me give you a concrete example of how this plays out. I was working with a woman, let's call her Sarah, who had been trying to launch a photography business for 5 years. 5 years. She had the talent, she had some clients, she had the equipment, but she could never seem to make it her full-time thing. Every time she got close, something would happen. She'd book a big shoot and then get sick. She'd plan a marketing campaign and then have a family emergency. She'd set up her website and then decide she needed to completely rebrand. And when we dug into what was actually happening psychologically, here's what we found. Sarah had grown up as the artistic one in her family. That was her identity. Her sister was the smart one, her brother was the athletic one, Sarah was the creative one. And being a professional photographer wasn't just a career to her. It was the ultimate validation of this core identity she'd built her entire self-concept around. The problem was, as long as she was trying to become a professional photographer, she got to keep that identity without risking it. The moment she actually became a professional photographer, she'd have to face the market's judgment. What if she wasn't as good as she thought? What if clients didn't want to hire her? What if her sister, the smart one, made a comment about how it's nice that Sarah gets to play with her camera while other people have real jobs? So she kept herself in this perpetual state of about to make it. She was always one rebrand away, one course away, one piece of equipment away. And every time she got close to actually putting herself out there in a real way, her nervous system would create a crisis that gave her a legitimate reason to pull back. Here's what most people don't realize. The crisis isn't bad luck. The crisis is the strategy. Your unconscious mind is incredibly skilled at creating situations that protect you from threats to your identity, even when those threats are actually opportunities. But it gets more complex because there's another mechanism at play here. It's something called the goal gradient hypothesis, and it explains why you often quit right when you're starting to see progress. The original research was done back in the 30s by a psychologist named Clark Hull. He noticed that rats running through mazes actually sped up as they got closer to the food reward. But here's the interesting part. When he looked at human behavior, he found the opposite pattern in certain contexts. When people are pursuing goals tied to their identity, they often slow down or quit as they approach success. A team of researchers at the University of Chicago explored this phenomenon in 2012. They tracked people trying to achieve various personal goals and found something remarkable. The closer people got to achieving an identity-relevant goal, the more anxiety they reported, and the more likely they were to self-sabotage. One participant in the study was training for a marathon, something he'd wanted to do since high school. As he got into better and better shape, as the marathon date approached, he started skipping training runs. He developed mysterious injuries. He started drinking more. And when the researchers interviewed him, he said something revealing. He said, "I realized that if I actually ran this marathon, I wouldn't be someone who's going to run a marathon someday. I'd just be someone who ran a marathon. And then what?" This is the identity crisis that success creates. As long as you're working towards something, you're in a state of becoming. You're full of potential. You're someone who could be great if you just had the time, the resources, the right circumstances. But the moment you achieve the thing, you have to face a new reality. Maybe the thing you achieve isn't as transformative as you hoped. Maybe you're still the same person with the same problems. Or maybe, and this is the really scary part, maybe you do transform and now you have to maintain a new identity that feels unfamiliar and uncomfortable. There's a researcher named Torrey Higgins who developed what he calls regulatory focus theory. He identified 2 different motivational systems: the promotion focus, where you're motivated by growth and advancement, and the prevention focus, where you're motivated by safety and avoiding loss. And here's what's crucial. For goals tied to your identity, Your brain often switches from promotion focus to prevention focus as you get closer to success. You stop thinking about what you'll gain and start thinking about what you'll lose. What will you lose if you succeed? You'll lose the comfort of potential. You'll lose the excuse for why your life isn't where you want it to be. You'll lose the familiar version of yourself. You'll lose the ability to say, I could do that if I really wanted to. Because now you've really wanted to, and you have to live with the results. Let me share another example. I knew a guy who spent years talking about starting a podcast. He was brilliant. He had great ideas. He had the equipment. He had the time. And he'd record episodes, edit them, get them ready to publish, and then delete them. He did this maybe 15 times over 2 years. And when I finally asked him what was really going on, he said something I'll never forget. He said, look, right now I'm a guy with a podcast that could be huge. I'm a guy with ideas people would want to hear. But if I publish it and nobody listens, then I'm just a guy with a failed podcast. I'm just another person shouting into the void. He was protecting the gap between his actual self and his ideal self. As long as he didn't publish, that gap existed in potential space where it couldn't be measured or judged or found lacking. Now here's where this gets even more interesting. There's a concept in psychology called action paralysis, and it's particularly relevant to creative and entrepreneurial pursuits. Research from the University of Pennsylvania found that when people have multiple paths to a goal they care about, they often end up taking none of them. The study followed aspiring writers who wanted to get published. Some writers were told there was basically one path to publication: submit to traditional publishers. Others were told there were many paths: traditional publishing, self-publishing, blogging, serialization, contests, whatever. The writers with one path were 3 times more likely to actually publish something within a year than the writers with multiple paths. Why? Because when you have options, every choice becomes a test of judgment. What if you choose the wrong path? What if there was a better way? The writers with multiple options spent their energy researching and planning and second-guessing instead of writing. And here's the kicker. They weren't procrastinating randomly. They were procrastinating strategically. Because as long as they were still deciding on the best approach, they hadn't failed at any approach. This connects to something called the paradox of choice, which was extensively studied by Barry Schwartz. But it goes deeper than just having too many options. When those options are tied to an identity goal, each choice carries the weight of your entire self-concept. You're not just choosing between self-publishing and traditional publishing. You're choosing between the version of yourself who's a scrappy independent artist and the version who's validated by the establishment. Both of those identities feel important, and choosing one feels like killing the other. So what do? You stay in research mode. You take another course. You read another book. You reorganize your workspace. You're not being lazy. You're engaging in what psychologists call defensive pessimism and strategic preparation, which are just fancy terms for creating the perfect conditions before you risk finding out if you're actually good enough. Let me tell you about the pattern I see over and over. Someone gets inspired, they start a project with enormous enthusiasm, they make initial progress, and then they hit what I call the messy middle. The messy middle is where the initial excitement has worn off, but you're not good enough yet to see real results. You're in that valley where you're bad enough to be frustrated, but invested enough to care. And this is the critical point. This is where most people quit. A longitudinal study from Stanford tracked people learning new skills over a 2-year period. They found that 81% of people quit during what they called the competence gap. That period where you understand enough to see all your flaws, but haven't developed the skills to fix them yet. And the bigger the gap between someone's ideal vision and their current performance, the faster they quit. Here's what's fascinating. The study found that people who ultimately succeeded didn't have more talent or discipline. They had a different relationship with the competence gap. Instead of seeing their current performance as evidence of their identity, they saw it as data. They'd think, okay, this draft is bad. What does that tell me about what I need to learn next? Instead of, this draft is bad, I guess I'm not actually a writer. That distinction is everything. One is an identity judgment. The other is a skill assessment. One is permanent and threatening. The other is temporary and informative. Now, let's talk about what actually allows people to stick with things they care about, because I promised you this would be actionable. The first thing you need to do is separate your identity from your performance. And I know that sounds impossible when the whole reason you care about something is because it's tied to who you want to be. But here's the shift. Instead of thinking I am a writer, think I am someone who writes. Instead of I am an entrepreneur, think I am someone who's building a business. That subtle linguistic shift does something powerful in your brain. Research on self-distancing shows that when you describe yourself in terms of actions rather than identities, you reduce the threat response that comes from failure. If you're a writer and you write something bad, that's an identity crisis. If you're someone who writes and you write something bad, that's a bad draft. One requires you to question your entire sense of self. The other requires you to write another draft. The second thing, and this is crucial, is you need to redefine what counts as success. Most people have success defined as the outcome, the published book, the profitable business, the six-pack abs. But outcomes are only partially under your control. What is fully under your control? Your actions. So you need to start measuring success by whether you showed up, not by whether you got the result you wanted. A researcher named B.J. Fogg at Stanford has studied behavior change for over 20 years, and his findings are clear. People who succeed at long-term behavior change focus on what he calls minimum viable actions. Not writing a great chapter, just writing for 10 minutes. Not getting 10 clients, just reaching out to one potential client. The magic isn't in the size of the action. The magic is in the identity shift that comes from consistent action regardless of outcome. Every time you write for 10 minutes, even if what you write is garbage, you're sending your brain evidence that you're someone who writes. And over time, that identity becomes more real than the identity you're protecting. You stop being someone who's going to write a novel and become someone who writes some days well, some days poorly, but always writing. Third thing, you need to expect and plan for the dip in motivation. This is where most people fail because they believe the myth that passionate people stay passionate all the time. That's not how any of this works. Motivation is cyclical. You're going to have days where you don't want to do the thing even though you care about it, especially because you care about it. Research on motivation shows that relying on how you feel to determine whether you act is the fastest way to quit anything. The people who stick with things have what psychologists call implementation intentions. They've decided in advance what they're going to do and when they're going to do it, independent of how they feel. So you don't wait until you feel inspired to write. You write every Tuesday and Thursday at 7 a.m., whether you feel like it or not. And here's what happens. About 70% of the time, once you start, the motivation follows the action. But even when it doesn't, even when it sucks the whole time, you're still building the identity of someone who shows up. Fourth, and this one is harder to hear, you need to get okay with being bad at something you care about. This is the part that kills people. We're willing to be bad at things we don't care about. We'll try a new sport and laugh at how terrible we are. But something we've built our identity around, we need to be good immediately, or it feels like evidence that we're frauds. There's a beautiful concept in Zen Buddhism called Shoshin, or beginner's mind. It's the idea that being a beginner is not a problem to be solved, but a state to be embraced. When you're a beginner, you're learning. You're supposed to be bad. That's not a character flaw, that's the process. But here's what we do instead. We compare ourselves to experts who've been doing this for 10 years, and we feel inadequate. We see the gap between where we are and where we want to be, and we interpret that gap as evidence that we're not meant to do this. And that's insane. That gap is supposed to be there. That gap is the entire journey. A study from Michigan State University found that people who succeed at creative pursuits share one common trait. They have what the researchers call growth-oriented perfectionism rather than fixed-oriented perfectionism. Fixed-oriented perfectionists believe they should already be good, so every mistake is devastating. Growth-oriented perfectionists believe they're supposed to get better over time, so every mistake is information. Same person, same mistakes, completely different meaning. One quits, because mistakes mean they're not a real artist. The other continues because mistakes mean they're learning. Fifth thing, you need to build what I call commitment devices. These are external structures that make it harder to quit when your brain starts generating excuses. Tell people what you're doing, not for accountability in the traditional sense, but because once you've told people, quitting has a social cost. Join a group of people doing the same thing. Not for motivation, but because showing up is easier when other people are expecting you. Research on social commitment shows that people are up to 4 times more likely to continue pursuing a goal when they've made their commitment public and when they have regular check-ins with others. Not because of shame, but because it adds an external structure to an internal motivation. Last thing, and this might be the most important, you need to practice self-compassion when you do quit or fail or mess up. Because you will. Everyone does. And the difference between people who eventually succeed and people who give up permanently is how they talk to themselves when things go wrong. Kristen Neff at the University of Texas has done extensive research on self-compassion, and her findings are remarkable. People who practice self-compassion are significantly more likely to try again after failure than people who practice self-criticism. Not because they care less about success, but because they don't interpret failure as evidence of personal inadequacy. When you mess up, when you skip a week, when you do bad work, you have a choice. You can say, see, I knew I couldn't do this, I'm not disciplined enough, I always quit. Or you can say, okay, I'm having a hard time right now, this is difficult, what do I need to get back on track? One interpretation ends the journey, the other continues it. Look, here's the truth that nobody wants to hear. You're gonna quit things. You're gonna start projects you don't finish. You're gonna have goals you don't achieve. That's not a character flaw. That's being human. The question isn't whether you'll quit. The question is whether quitting becomes your identity or whether it becomes data. The people who ultimately achieve things they care about aren't people who never quit. They're people who quit, learn something, and start again. They're people who fail, feel terrible about it, practice self-compassion, and try a different approach. They're people who've learned to separate their worth from their performance and their identity from their outcomes. You don't quit things you care about because you're lazy or broken or lack willpower. You quit because caring makes the stakes unbearably high, and your brain is trying to protect you from the existential threat of finding out you're not who you hoped you were. But here's the thing your brain doesn't understand. The only way to become who you want to be is to risk discovering you're not there yet. The only way to write a good book is to write bad drafts. The only way to build a successful business is to fail at parts of it. The only way to become the person you want to be is to be the person you are right now, imperfect and learning and showing up anyway. So the next time you feel the urge to quit something you care about, pause. Ask yourself, am I quitting because this isn't actually important to me? Or am I quitting because it is? Am I protecting myself from failure? Or am I protecting myself from finding out what's possible? And then make a choice, not based on fear, not based on protecting your ego, but based on whether this is the person you want to become. You've got this. Now go do the thing you've been avoiding.